December 1944. A frozen ridgeline in the Belgian Ardennes, decades after the Battle of the Bulge, a legend emerged in post-war memoirs. An American anti-tank crew spotted a monstrous German Tiger II and destroyed it with a single, impossible shot from over 2,000 yards away. It became one of the most famous sniper tank duels of the war. But there is a glaring problem. Cross-referencing American ballistics data, topographical maps, and the severe winter weather reports of that day proves that shot was physically impossible. So, if it wasn't a legendary 2,000-yard sniper shot, what actually killed that 70-ton machine? To answer that, we have to strip away decades of adrenaline-fueled, romanticized mythology. The narrative of a clean, heroic duel across a frozen, snow-swept valley is undeniably compelling. But the reality of armored combat during the Battle of the Bulge was far messier, dictated not by cinematic marksmanship, but by physics, logistics, and sudden, terrifying close-quarters encounters. We are going to dismantle one of the most enduring legends of the Ardennes offensive to uncover what genuinely happened to that specific King Tiger. To do this, we will reconstruct the true nature of the engagement by tracking down primary combat logs, daily unit journals, and ordnance reports that were written before the fog of memory set in. We will analyze the brutal limitations of standard Allied firepower against the heaviest operational tank of the war, separating documented historical truth from the embellished tales of veterans trying to process the chaos of combat. The true demise of this 70-ton machine did not happen exactly the way the popular accounts claim, and we are going to withhold the precise location of the actual skirmish until the forensic evidence on its shattered hull can finally speak for itself. But before we can look at the map and pinpoint the exact coordinates of the killing blow, we must first understand the environment that made such a myth possible. Because long before a gunner peered through an optical sight, both American anti-tank crews and German panzer commanders were operating under conditions of profound tactical blindness, trapped in a freezing, claustrophobic landscape that exposed the severe technological limitations of both armies that winter. By the late autumn of 1944, the American anti-tank doctrine was facing a crisis of physics. The Allied forces pushing toward the German border were primarily equipped to handle Panzer IVs and the occasional Panther, relying heavily on a mathematically calculated system of mobile tank destroyers. The standard American response to German armor was the 76mm gun, mounted on the fast M18 Hellcat and the later models of the M4 Sherman, or the older 3-inch gun utilized by the M10 Wolverine. For heavier threats, they possessed the potent 90mm gun, which was towed into position or mounted on the newer M36 Jackson. On paper, at testing grounds in Maryland or under perfect desert conditions, these guns were highly effective. But warfare is rarely fought on flat testing grounds, and the reality of the European theater was forcing American gunners to confront a terrifying mathematical deficit. The primary nightmare of the Allied anti-tank crew was the Panzerkampfwagen 6 Ausführung B, universally known as the Tiger II or the King Tiger. This machine was not just a heavy tank, it was a rolling fortress explicitly designed to dominate massive, open expanses of terrain. Its most formidable feature was its frontal armor. The upper glacis plate consisted of 150 millimeters of hardened steel, sloped backward at a steep 50-degree angle. This sloping was critical. It meant that any incoming armor-piercing round did not just have to punch through 150 millimeters of metal. It had to defeat a relative line-of-sight thickness of well over 230 millimeters, while also battling the tendency of the highly angled armor to deflect or shatter the projectile's nose upon impact. When you run the ballistic data for standard American ordnance in late 1944, the myth of a 2,000-yard frontal kill against a Tiger II instantly begins to unravel. An American 76mm armor-piercing round fired from a Sherman or a Hellcat lost significant kinetic energy for every 100 yards it traveled through the cold air. Even at point-blank range, under 100 yards, a standard M62 projectile would harmlessly ricochet off the upper glacis of a king tiger. The more powerful 90mm gun was similarly impotent against the frontal hull of the beast at standard combat ranges. To kill a Tiger II, American gunners had to maneuver. They had to hit the vertical 80mm side armor, target the thinner rear engine deck, or find a lucky trap beneath the gun mantlet. But penetrating the thick, sloped front at a distance of over a mile? The kinetic energy required simply did not exist in the standard Allied arsenal. A shell traveling 2,000 yards would have bled so much velocity that striking the sloped glacis would be akin to throwing a stone against a bank vault. Yet, if the Americans were technologically outmatched in raw frontal ballistics, the Germans were severely handicapped by the very design of their ultimate weapon. The Tiger II was engineered for the vast, sweeping steppes of the Eastern Front or the flat agricultural plains of Northern Europe. Its tremendous 88mm gun, paired with exceptional Zeiss stereoscopic optics, allowed German gunners to identify, target, and destroy enemy armor at ranges exceeding 2 miles. In an open field, a heavy panzer battalion could annihilate an American armored column long before the Americans could even close into their own effective firing range. The Tiger II was a sniper. It required long, open sightlines to survive because its immense weight, tipping the scales at nearly 70 tons, made it sluggish, mechanically fragile, and heavily reliant on clear, solid ground. Adolf Hitler's decision to launch the last great Western offensive through the Ardennes forest negated every single tactical advantage the Tiger II possessed. The geography of the Belgian and Luxembourgish borders is characterized by ancient, dense pine forests, deep, plunging ravines, and steep, rocky ridgelines. There are no sweeping steppes here. The road network in December 1944 consisted mostly of narrow, winding dirt tracks built for logging trucks and horse-drawn carts, not for armored behemoths spanning 12 feet across. This terrain created a claustrophobic, highly restrictive theater of war, where maneuverability was practically zero. Vehicles were entirely road-bound, trapped in endless columns flanked by impenetrable tree lines on one side and sheer drops on the other. This geographical chokehold was then compounded by an absolute environmental nightmare. As the German offensive commenced, the region was slammed by some of the most severe winter weather recorded in Europe in decades. A brutal, freezing front settled over the Ardennes, blanketing the narrow valleys in deep snow and generating thick, impenetrable layers of freezing fog. This fog clung to the dense pine canopies and settled heavily into the ravines, creating a surreal, zero-visibility battlefield. The vaunted German Zeiss optics, calibrated to kill at thousands of yards, were rendered completely useless. In the heavy forests that December, visibility frequently dropped to under 200 yards, and in many critical sectors, it was less than 50. Both armies were effectively fighting blind. The conflict transformed from a war of armored maneuver into a brutal series of point-blank ambushes. American anti-tank crews, acutely aware that they could not penetrate the heavy German armor from the front, were forced to hide their towed guns and tank destroyers deep in the tree lines, waiting for the clanking tracks and roaring engines to emerge from the mist. The sheer sensory deprivation of this environment was terrifying. Crews would hear the deep, rhythmic grinding of a 70-ton tank echoing through the frozen valleys long before they could see it. They would feel the frozen ground vibrating beneath their boots, knowing that a monster was crawling up the narrow mountain road toward their position. But the fog operated like a thick white wall. They had to hold their fire, waiting until the gray steel silhouette finally broke through the mist, often at distances so agonizingly close they could hear the German commanders shouting over their radios. For the German panzer crews sealed inside the Tiger IIs, the Ardennes was an equally terrifying trap. Stripped of their ability to engage at long range, they were forced into a chaotic, close-quarters boxing match. Their heavy tanks were sluggish to turn on the icy, narrow roads. If the lead tank in a column was hit and disabled, The entire column was paralyzed, unable to push the 70-ton wreckage off the tight mountain tracks, and unable to reverse. They were blind giants, stumbling through a frozen labyrinth, constantly vulnerable to infantry bazooka teams and hidden anti-tank guns firing at their weaker side armor from the flanks. This profound mismatch, a tank designed for wide-open spaces, forced into a blind, frozen corridor, is the absolute core of understanding what happened during the Battle of the Bulge. The environment dictated the engagement ranges. Physics dictated the limits of armor penetration. The dense pine forests and the heavy winter fog ensured that long-range duels were not just highly improbable, they were physically impossible. No gunner, American or German, could see a target at 2,000 yards through a dense Ardennes blizzard. And even if by some miracle the skies briefly cleared, the American guns simply lacked the kinetic velocity to punch through a King Tiger's frontal armor at that extreme distance. The myth of the legendary shot relies on a clean line of sight across a vast, snowy expanse, completely ignoring the claustrophobic, restrictive, and blinding reality of the Belgian valleys. It asks us to believe in a pristine sniper duel in a battlefield where men were practically stumbling into each other in the dark. The weather and the heavy forest set a terrifying stage where combat was intimate, sudden, and fought at desperately close quarters. But the environment is only the first piece of the puzzle. The environment set a terrifying stage, but the first definitive clue that breaks the 2,000-yard myth comes directly from the topographical maps of the battlefield. When investigators pull the declassified after-action reports of the American anti-tank units operating in this specific sector of the Ardennes, they find a precise set of grid coordinates marking the location of the destroyed Tiger II. To cross-reference this claim, military historians turn to the captured war diaries of the German 500 1st Heavy Panzer Battalion, the premier heavy armor unit tasked with spearheading the northern thrust of the offensive. Their internal movement logs record the exact route their heavy companies took through the frozen valleys that week. The coordinates match. The wreck of a massive King Tiger was indeed documented at this exact geographical choke point. But when you take those confirmed coordinates and plot them onto a period-accurate 1 to 50,000 scale United States Army topographical map of the Belgian theater, a glaring physical contradiction instantly materializes. The veteran accounts, repeated for decades in memoirs and history books, describe a sprawling cinematic duel, an American gunner spotting the German Leviathan across a wide snow-swept expanse and engaging it at over 2,000 yards. The contour lines on the map tell a fundamentally different story. The confirmed location of the wreckage sits near the bottom of a steep, winding ravine, heavily flanked by dense, old-growth pine forests. To achieve a 2,000-yard line of sight from the nearest American defensive positions to the spot where the German tank was actually destroyed, the American gunner's shell would have had to travel straight through 3 solid ridgelines, curve around a heavily wooded bend, and ignore the curvature of a massive limestone bluff. A modern terrain profile analysis confirms the hard, objective truth. A 2,000-yard line of sight simply did not exist anywhere in that sector. It was not merely obscured by weather or fog. It was physically blocked by millions of tons of Belgian rock and timber. The maximum possible unobstructed view from any tactical elevation in that valley, looking down onto the narrow road where the King Tiger halted, was barely 400 yards. In most places, the thick pine canopy reduced that sightline to less than 150. This is where the fog of war collides violently with objective data. The veteran accounts insist on a long-range masterclass of gunnery. The rigid topography of the Ardennes firmly insists it was impossible. When terrified men are processing the extreme trauma of a sudden, deafening armored clash in freezing temperatures, distances warp. A hulking 70-ton monster emerging from the mist feels infinitely larger, and the space between the gun and the target feels dangerously vast. Memory creates the sprawling valley to make sense of the overwhelming terror. But the math of the landscape is utterly unforgiving. The legend is geometrically broken. By geographically eliminating the possibility of a long-range sniper duel, the topography forces a much more terrifying reality into focus. The American anti-tank crew did not have the luxury of distance. They did not have 2,000 yards to line up a perfect, clinical shot against the most heavily armored vehicle in the world. Instead, the map proves they were trapped in the very same claustrophobic, restrictive nightmare as their enemy. If the fatal blow was not delivered from a mile away, then the American gunners had to have engaged the impenetrable German behemoth at agonizingly close range, inside a confined spatial trap where the standard physics of frontal armor penetration dictated that they should have died. The question is no longer how they made an impossible long-range shot. The question is how they managed to survive a point-blank encounter with a King Tiger in a space so claustrophobic that neither machine could maneuver. To understand the sheer terror of that point-blank survival, one must first dissect the physical reality of the machine the Americans were facing. Because the King Tiger was not merely an upgrade to the German arsenal, it was a fundamental shift in armored warfare philosophy. By late 1944, the original Tiger I, with its boxy vertical armor, was slowly becoming obsolete. While its 100mm thick frontal plate had been a nightmare for Allied tankers in 1942 and 1943, the relentless advancement in Soviet and Western anti-tank ballistics had begun to crack the Krupp steel. The vertical geometry of the Tiger I meant that incoming kinetic energy was absorbed directly, and newer Allied guns could now punch through it at standard combat ranges. The German engineering response to this vulnerability was the Panzerkampfwagen 6 Ausführung B. The designers at Henschel and Porsche abandoned the flat surfaces of the original Tiger and adopted the revolutionary sloping armor profile of the medium Panther tank, but they scaled it up to apocalyptic proportions. The resulting King Tiger was a masterpiece of defensive geometry. Its upper glacis plate was forged from 150mm of face-hardened steel, but crucially, it was angled backward at a steep 50 degrees. This was the mathematical death sentence for any American gunner attempting a frontal shot in the narrow confines of an Ardennes ravine. When a standard American 76mm armor-piercing projectile struck that sloped plate, it did not hit a flat wall, it hit an inclined ramp. The geometry of the slope meant the shell had to carve its way through a relative line-of-sight thickness of over 230mm of solid metal. Furthermore, the extreme angle practically guaranteed that the hardened nose of the American M62 projectile would either shatter on impact or violently deflect upward into the freezing air, leaving nothing but a glowing, superficial gouge on the German paintwork. The turret front, depending on the production model, boasted up to 185mm of armor, curving seamlessly to deflect incoming fire. For an American anti-tank crew hidden in the timber, recognizing the silhouette of a Tiger II meant recognizing a terrifying absolute. If the front of that tank is pointed at you, your weapons are mathematically useless. To engage it head-on in a claustrophobic forest corridor where flanking maneuvers were blocked by sheer rock walls and dense pines was not an act of bravery. It was an act of guaranteed suicide. Inside the steel bellies of these leviathans, the German crews of the Schwere SS Panzerabteilung 501 were acutely aware of their frontal invulnerability. Attached to Kampfgruppe Piper, the armored spearhead tasked with tearing a hole through the northern shoulder of the American lines, these men were largely hardened veterans of the brutal armored clashes on the Eastern Front. As they crossed the line of departure in the pre-dawn darkness of December 16th, the mood inside the heated, dimly lit turrets was one of supreme, almost arrogant confidence. Their internal movement logs and surviving diaries reflect a pervasive belief that they were operating an apocalyptic weapon that simply could not be stopped by anything in the American arsenal. Surrounded by thousands of pounds of highly refined, sloped steel armor, the 5 men inside each King Tiger felt a profound sense of psychological security. The massive 88mm KWK-43L/71 main gun mounted in front of them could penetrate the frontal armor of a standard American Sherman tank at ranges exceeding 2.5 miles. The engine hummed with mechanical authority. The complex interleaved road wheels distributed the massive weight of the vehicle to provide a surprisingly smooth ride on flat ground. And the crews believed they were driving an impenetrable spear straight to the Meuse River. But as the days bled into the freezing, chaotic reality of the Ardennes offensive, that supreme technological confidence began to violently erode. The environment itself was actively turning their ultimate weapon against them. The German High Command's grand strategic vision of a lightning strike through the Belgian forests had failed to account for the agonizing friction of the local topography. The designated routes of advance, the Rollbahnen, were not modern highways. They were primitive, single-lane logging trails, deeply rutted, composed of soft earth, and completely unsuited for armored vehicles measuring 12 feet across and weighing nearly 70 tons. As the vanguard of the 500 first pushed deeper into the winding, plunging ravines, the King Tiger transformed from an unstoppable fortress into a crippling logistical liability. The primary culprit was the engine. The King Tiger was powered by the Maybach HL230P30, a V12 gasoline engine that was originally designed to propel a 45-ton vehicle. Forcing that same power plant to move an additional 25 tons of sloped armor up steep, icy gradients placed a catastrophic strain on the entire mechanical ecosystem of the tank. The drivers, sealed in their cold steel compartments at the front of the hull, had to constantly ride the clutch and shift through the complex Maybach Olvar transmission just to keep the behemoths moving at a walking pace. The immense torque required to push 70 tons through deep mud and over frozen rock outcroppings began to systematically destroy the tank's final drives. The internal gears, already suffering from late war shortages in critical hardening alloys like molybdenum and tungsten, were prone to sudden, catastrophic shearing. A single snapped gear tooth in the final drive could instantly paralyze the tank, turning the ultimate weapon into a 70-ton steel bunker blocking the only path forward for the entire armored column. This mechanical anxiety was compounded by a severe, rapidly developing fuel crisis. Pushing that much weight through deep snow and thick mud caused fuel consumption to skyrocket well beyond the planners' estimates. The heavy panzer battalions were burning through hundreds of gallons of synthetic gasoline just to advance a few miles, and the narrow, congested dirt roads meant that the unarmored German supply trucks could not reach the vanguard to refuel them. The crews found themselves trapped in a terrifying paradox. They possessed a machine capable of destroying any Allied tank in existence, but they were terrified of simply running out of gas and being forced to abandon their impenetrable fortresses in the middle of a frozen forest. Simultaneously, the tactical environment was stripping away the Tiger II's offensive capabilities. The freezing fog that settled into the Ardennes valleys operated like a thick white blindfold. The German commanders, standing in their cupolas, could barely see past the end of their own massive gun barrels. Buttoned up tight behind their periscopes, visibility was effectively reduced to zero. To navigate the treacherous, winding mountain tracks, the panzer commanders were forced to open their hatches and expose their heads and shoulders to the biting cold, scanning the dense, shadowy tree lines for any sign of movement. They were blind giants stumbling through a frozen labyrinth. Even worse, the sheer mass of the tank was weaponizing the terrain against the crew. If a King Tiger found itself on a steep incline or tilted heavily on a muddy bank, the hydraulic turret traverse system simply could not generate enough pressure to rotate the massive 13-ton turret. To bring the main gun to bear on a target, the gunner was forced to disengage the hydraulics and rely on the manual hand crank. It took hundreds of agonizing, physically exhausting rotations of the handwheel just to traverse the turret a few degrees. In an open field, this sluggishness was manageable because the tank had miles of standoff distance to acquire its target. but in the claustrophobic confines of an Ardennes ravine, where engagement ranges were measured in mere feet, a slow-turning turret was a death sentence. The technological edge of the King Tiger had fully metamorphosed into a tactical trap. The machine was too heavy, too wide, too slow, and completely blind in the fog. While the German crews wrestled with mechanical failures and environmental blindness, the American anti-tank detachments, hidden in the timber, were adapting to a radically different reality. Acutely aware that a frontal confrontation meant instant annihilation, these small, isolated crews utilized the dense pine canopy to offset their massive technological disadvantage. The Americans were playing a terrifying, high-stakes game of cat and mouse, relying entirely on camouflage, acoustic discipline, and the element of total surprise. The sensory experience for an American gun crew waiting in the Ardennes tree line was a psychological crucible. Long before they could see the gray camouflage paint of the German armor, they could feel its approach. The frozen ground would begin to vibrate steadily beneath their boots. Then, the distinct, rhythmic auditory signature of a heavy panzer battalion would bleed through the fog. The deep, guttural bass of the Maybach 512 engines, echoing off the limestone cliffs, was accompanied by the terrifying metallic squeal of the Tiger's dry track pins grinding against each other, and the relentless crunching of the massive, overlapping road wheels pulverizing the frozen earth. The Americans knew exactly what was crawling up the narrow road toward their position, but the thick white mist operated as a solid wall. The discipline required in these moments was immense. An inexperienced gunner, panicked by the sheer size of the gray silhouette breaking through the fog, might instinctively pull the trigger the moment the tank appeared. But firing prematurely was fatal. If the American crew fired too early and their armor-piercing rounds struck the sloped frontal glacis of the King Tiger, the shell would merely shatter into sparking fragments, completely failing to penetrate the crew compartment. In that exact second, the muzzle flash and the concussive shock wave of the American gun would instantly reveal their hidden position in the tree line. The German commander would rapidly slew his turret, and the 88mm gun would obliterate the American position before they could even attempt to reload. Survival, therefore, demanded an agonizing exercise in restraint. The American crew had to hold their fire, crouching in the freezing snow, watching the massive gun barrel of the Tiger II sweep past their concealed position at distances so intimate they could hear the clanking of the spent shell casings inside the German turret and the shouted orders of the panzer commander over the intercom. They were waiting for a highly specific geometric window. While the front of the King Tiger was heavily sloped and practically invulnerable, the side armor of the hull and the turret was forged from 80mm of vertical steel. Unlike the front, this side armor was not sloped. It was flat, unangled metal, completely vulnerable to a standard American 76mm or 90mm armor-piercing round at close range. The American gunners were not looking to engage in a sprawling sniper duel. They were looking to execute a point-blank assassination. They needed the German tank to expose its soft underbelly, its vertical flanks, or the thin armor protecting the rear engine deck. To get this shot, the Americans had to let the 70-ton behemoth crawl directly into their kill zone, tracking the vehicle's movement through the trees, constantly evaluating the angle of the armor, and waiting for the exact millisecond the geometry shifted in their favor. It was a brutal calculus, where mobility, stealth, and terrain mattered infinitely more than raw armor thickness. The American crews were leveraging the restrictive geography of the Ardennes to force the invulnerable German weapon into a position of absolute vulnerability. The climax of this claustrophobic engagement inevitably arrived when the rigid limitations of the German machine violently collided with the tactical patience of the American crew. Deep in the winding ravine, the lead King Tiger of the column encountered a critical bottleneck. The exact nature of the obstacle, a felled pine tree, a deep crater from Allied artillery, or simply a treacherous patch of black ice hidden beneath the snow, mattered less than its mechanical consequence. The heavy tank was forced to halt. Inside the German compartment, the sudden cessation of forward momentum triggered an immediate spike in panic. The driver, realizing the tank was losing its grip on the frozen trail, instinctively attempted to power through, gunning the Maybach engine and dumping raw torque into the transmission. But the massive, wide tracks, lacking the necessary traction on the icy mud, began to spin uselessly. Instead of pushing the 70-ton vehicle forward, the steel cleats dug downward, rapidly excavating a deep, muddy trench in the frozen earth. The King Tiger was bogging down, its hull slowly sinking toward the ground as the tracks chewed away the solid footing. The psychological state inside the turret instantly inverted. The arrogant confidence that had fueled the crew at the start of the offensive evaporated, replaced by the terrifying realization that they were trapped inside a steel box, immobilized in a narrow corridor entirely controlled by the enemy. The German commander, shouting frantically over the intercom, ordered the driver to reverse, to pivot, to do anything to extract the machine from the muddy trap. The transmission whined in protest, the massive gears grinding against each other as the driver desperately tried to walk the tank backward. The turret began to slowly, sluggishly rotate, the gunner fighting the heavy hand crank to swing the 88mm barrel toward the dark, threatening timber on their flanks, searching blindly for an enemy they could not see. Simultaneously, the American crew, hidden in the tree line, realized the power dynamic had permanently shifted. The terrifying, unstoppable Leviathan was stuck. The deafening roar of the over-revving Maybach engine masked any noise the Americans made as they frantically made their final adjustments. The prey was now the predator. The American gunner, his eye pressed tightly against the freezing optic of his sight, watched as the panicked maneuvering of the German driver inadvertently exposed the tank's fatal flaw. As the King Tiger struggled to pivot in the mud, its massive hull shifted, turning away from the American position and rotating the impenetrable sloped glacis out of the line of fire. The geometry of the engagement snapped into perfect, deadly alignment. Filling the American optical sight was not the angled front plate, but the broad, flat, vertical expanse of the King Tiger's 80mm side armor, exposed just above the massive interleaved road wheels. The American gunner did not have to calculate drop over 2,000 yards. He did not have to account for extreme wind drift or the kinetic energy bleed of a long-distance trajectory. The target was practically breathing on him, filling the entire reticle, trapped in the mud and desperately trying to turn its heavy turret to face the threat. The American loader slammed a heavy, armor-piercing projectile into the breach, the metal block locking upward with a sharp, definitive crack. The gunner made a microscopic adjustment to his elevation hand wheel, settling the crosshairs precisely on the center mass of the vertical side plate, specifically aiming for the ammunition stowage bins located in the sponsons directly beneath the turret ring. The confrontation that followed lasted only a fraction of a second, a violent, blinding release of kinetic energy that instantly shattered the freezing silence of the Ardennes. The deafening roar of the point-blank engagement echoed through the narrow ravines, rapidly fading back into the howling winter wind, leaving behind nothing but the crackle of burning synthetic fuel and a smoking 70-ton carcass resting awkwardly in the mud. The truth of how this specific King Tiger died, the exact trajectory of the fatal blow, and the undeniable proof of the agonizingly close range at which this battle was actually fought, was not lost to the chaotic, adrenaline-fueled memories of the men who survived. The indisputable physical evidence of this claustrophobic cat-and-mouse game was permanently stamped into the shattered steel of the tank itself. And the final proof of how this Leviathan was truly brought down will be found in a stark, forensic photograph captured by a United States Army Signal Corps photographer sent to document the wreckage just days after the smoke had cleared in the valley. When Ordnance intelligence teams arrived at the wreck site in early 1945, they were not interested in the heroic tales already spreading among the infantry. They were conducting a battlefield autopsy. Armed with calipers, measuring tapes, and heavy format cameras, these military engineers treated the shattered 70-ton hull as a crime scene. The resulting black and white photographs survive in the National Archives today, and they completely dismantle the 2,000-yard legend. The images do not show a miraculous crater carved into the sloped frontal glacis. In fact, the forward armor is entirely unblemished. Instead, the camera lens zeroes in on the vehicle's right flank. There, punched cleanly through the vertical steel of the lower hull, just above the overlapping road wheels, is a catastrophic entry hole. The engineers meticulously documented the metallurgical spalling and the trajectory of the penetration. Their ballistic report concluded that the fatal armor-piercing shell struck at an angle and velocity that was physically impossible to achieve from a mile away. The kinetic energy required to shear through that specific plate, creating that distinct entry wound, dictated a maximum firing distance of barely 150 yards. This forensic reality creates a profound psychological conflict. How does a confirmed point-blank ambush morph into a legendary long-range duel in the minds of the men who fought it? The answer lies in the deeply distortive nature of combat trauma. When a human being is severely outgunned and staring down a mechanical leviathan, adrenaline heavily warps the nervous system. The brain, attempting to process the sheer, overwhelming terror of that machine emerging from the winter fog, drastically stretches space and time. In the memories of the survivors, the distance had to be vast, because the reality that they were mere yards away from certain annihilation was too horrifying to fully integrate into a casual post-war narrative. The 2,000-yard claim was not a deliberate deception. It was a psychological byproduct of extreme survival. Yet the cold, unfeeling math of the penetration hole strips away that protective mental barrier. The battlefield photographs capture the brutal physical result, but they inherently withhold the visceral, terrifying details of those final, agonizing seconds before the trigger was pulled. The engineers could measure the ruptured steel, but they could not document the sheer human discipline required to hold the line in the snow. Because a side armor impact with that much retained velocity meant only one thing. The American anti-tank crew recognized the absolute futility of a frontal assault, held their nerve in the blinding mist, and intentionally let the monster get right on top of them before making their move. The combat diaries of the anti-tank units stationed in that timber describe a freezing, agonizing paralysis. Temperatures hovered near zero, frosting the heavy metal breeches of the American guns and numbing the hands of the loaders. They had been waiting in the blinding white mist for hours, completely exposed to the elements, when the ground finally began to tremble. The acoustic warning arrived long before the visual one. The guttural, labored roar of the Maybach V12 engine fighting the steep incline, the metallic shriek of dry track pins, and the relentless, rhythmic crunch of 70 tons of steel pulverizing the frozen earth. When the fog finally parted, the sheer scale of the King Tiger emerging onto the narrow logging trail was paralyzing. It was not a distant, theoretical target in a sniper's reticle. It was an overwhelming physical presence, looming just over 100 yards away, filling the entire width of the track. Every human instinct, amplified by adrenaline and profound terror, screamed at the American gunner to fire immediately. But firing at the sloped frontal glacis meant instantly giving away their concealed position with a massive muzzle flash, inviting a high-explosive 88mm response that would obliterate their squad. The squad leader demanded absolute discipline. They had to hold the line. The crew crouched in the snow, breathless, watching the gray Leviathan slowly crawl closer. 100 yards, 75 yards. The noise was deafening, the heavy exhaust fumes mixing with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. They could hear the German tracks violently slipping on the icy mud. Then, the restrictive geography of the Ardennes forced the German driver's hand. Approaching a tight, heavily rutted bend in the ravine, the driver had to break the inner track and dump torque into the outer track to force the massive machine to pivot. The heavy steel cleats spun, chewing violently through the frozen crust and sliding laterally into the soft earth. As the 70-ton chassis groaned and fought the treacherous terrain, the hull shifted. The impenetrable 50-degree frontal slope slowly rotated away from the American position. In its place, the broad, flat, 80-millimeter vertical steel of the King Tiger's right flank swung squarely into the American gunner's optic. The command was shouted over the roar of the German engine. The American gun violently recoiled, sending a blinding spear of yellow flame through the timber. The heavy, armor-piercing projectile crossed the agonizingly short distance in a fraction of a heartbeat. At point-blank range, there was no ballistic drop, no energy bleed. The shell slammed into the vertical side plate just above the overlapping road wheels with absolute kinetic authority. The impact sheared straight through the Krupp steel. A catastrophic rupture echoed through the valley as the shell penetrated the fighting compartment. Within seconds, thick, acrid smoke began pouring from the engine louvers and the turret ring. The heavy steel hatches violently slammed open, and the surviving German crew members, their supreme technological confidence shattered, scrambled frantically out of the smoking hole and disappeared into the biting mist. The deafening chaos of the ambush evaporated, leaving only the crackle of burning synthetic oil and the mechanical ticking of the dying fortress. The American crew had executed a flawless, point-blank assassination under unimaginable psychological pressure. They had looked the deadliest machine on Earth in the eye, held their nerve in a claustrophobic trap, and survived. It was a raw, brutal, and desperately intimate victory of human discipline over heavy armor, which makes the ultimate fate of this battle so perplexing. If the reality of this engagement was such a terrifying, undisputed testament to the tactical courage of that American crew, why was it completely rewritten? Why did history, and eventually the veterans themselves, choose to erase this suffocating struggle in the mud, replacing it with the sterile, heroic myth of a clean sniper duel from 2,000 yards away? The answer lies in how we are conditioned to remember war. After 1945, the triumphant narrative of the Allied victory required clean, decisive moments. A 2,000-yard sniper duel fits perfectly into that mold. It implies total control. It paints a picture of calm, detached professionalism, where American gunners use superior skill to dismantle the German war machine from a safe, sanitary distance. It is a cinematic concept, easily digestible for a post-war public that wanted to believe their soldiers were always the masters of the battlefield, striking down the fascist beast with surgical precision. But that sanitized narrative strips the men in the tree line of their actual, raw courage. Describing a battle where you were completely outgunned, trapped in freezing mud, and forced to hide in sheer terror until the enemy made a fatal geographical mistake, does not sound like a Hollywood victory. For the veterans returning home, the suffocating trauma of that claustrophobic ambush was almost impossible to articulate to anyone who had never felt the ground shake beneath a 70-ton King Tiger. Over decades of retellings, reunions, and published memoirs, the subconscious need to process that trauma, combined with a culture hungry for straightforward heroism, stretched the distance. 150 terrifying yards slowly expanded into an impossible mythological mile. When we use forensic analysis, terrain mapping, and ballistic physics to dismantle these post-war legends, the goal is never to diminish the bravery of the men who fought. It is to rescue their true experience from the sterile pages of mythology. The legend of the impossible shot turns that anti-tank crew into fictional superheroes operating in a vacuum. The muddy, logistical reality restores their humanity. It demands that we recognize what they actually endured: the freezing temperatures, the absolute vulnerability of their position, and the agonizing tactical discipline required to hold their fire while a mechanical leviathan bore down on them. A long-range sniper shot is merely an exercise in mathematics and optics. But choosing to sit in the dense Ardennes fog, shivering behind a towed gun, and waiting for the heaviest tank in the world to expose its flank at point-blank range? That is a testament to an entirely different, far more profound kind of human endurance. Understanding the brutal, restrictive reality of that Belgian valley does not make the destruction of that king tiger less impressive. It reveals exactly how terrifying it truly was to pull the trigger. The king tiger was not defeated by a miraculous sniper bullet defying the laws of physics, but by the dense trees, the freezing mud, and the terrifying necessity of close-quarters survival. In the claustrophobic ravines of the Ardennes, victory was rarely about perfect long-range ballistics, but about possessing the cold, agonizing nerve to hold your fire until the very last second. When we strip away the comforting myths of distance and precision, we are left with the fundamental truth of armored combat that winter. Survival was forged in the freezing mist, where the terrain stripped away technological superiority and left human discipline to decide the fate of battle.